Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the afternoon session of our symposium. I hope you all enjoyed a little bit of the sunshine over the lunch break, even if it was just to sneak out for a second. Um, and we are here for the third panel today, and I'm excited to hear what our panelists have to add to the discussion. The third panel is called Eroding Trust for Police Post-Whren. When or how did we get here, and what does it mean? We have with us Jonathan Blanks. He is a graduate of Indiana University and a research associate at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. He works on the Institute's Project on Criminal Justice and is the managing editor of policemisconduct.net. His research is focused on law enforcement practices, overcriminalization, and civil liberties. He has appeared on various television, radio, and internet media, including HuffPost Live and The Voice of America. His work has been published in several publications, including the Washington Post, the New Republic, Denver Post, and the Chicago Tribune. So welcome to Jonathan Blanks. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm introducing them not in the order that they're going to speak, so don't worry about that. We also have with us Dr. Dolores Jones-Brown. Dr. Jones-Brown is a professor in the Department of Law, Police Science, and Criminal Justice Administration at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, City University of New York. She is the founding director of the John Jay College Center on Race, Crime, and Justice, where she currently serves as the faculty research fellow. Her areas of research and scholarship include race, crime, and the administration of justice, police, community relations, juvenile justice, and the legal socialization of adolescent males. Her book, Race, Crime, and Punishment, won a New York Public Library Award in 2001. And in addition to the multiple articles, book chapters, and legal commentaries, she is the co-editor of two additional books, The System in Black and White, Exploring the Connections Between Race, Crime, and Justice, and Policing and Minority Communities, Bridging the Gap. So welcome to you, Dr. Jones-Brown. We also have with us, last but not least, and he actually will speak last, William G. Otis. Bill Otis is an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University and a one-time federal prosecutor and former special White House counsel for President George H.W. Bush. After graduating from Stanford Law School, he started his career in the criminal division of the Justice Department and then became the chief of appeals for the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Virginia. In the 1980s, he served on the department's Train the Trainer team, which taught U.S. attorney offices across the county how to implement the then new Sentencing Reform Act. He's had several posts in federal government, including special assistant to the Secretary of Energy and counselor to the head of the DEA, in addition to the White House post. He has testified before Congress on issues in criminal procedure, illegal drugs, and the U.S. Sentencing Commission, and the death penalty. He's also given numerous media interviews on those topics and other subjects as well. He currently teaches a seminar at Georgetown Law entitled Conservatism in Law and America, in Law in America, with his wife, Federalist Society co-founder Lee Lieberman Otis. So welcome to our panelists. As we did this morning, we will leave a period of time at the end for questions, so if you hold them until the end, and then if you wait for the microphone, since we are being webcast, and so that everybody online can hear the questions as well. Thank you. And I think Dr. Jones-Brown is going to go first.
Good afternoon. Can hear you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hi. So I'm originally from the South, and I was born in the South and was alive during the 1960s. And so what has been sort of distressing for the state of police and community relations these last 2 years at least is that we've circled back to a place where we've been before. And I think Whren is at part of the vehicle by which we ended up back in this place. Okay. So what Whren did, Whren actually facilitated the overt racism that was and has been a part of the fabric of this country. It also legitimized the unconscious racism that social psychologists are now starting to talk about, and police departments are finally starting to at least explore. Police departments have moved away from denying the impact of race in their practices to feeling better because the social psychologists have told them it's not their fault, it's not intentional. And so at least the conversation about race takes place. But what the Whren decision really did was to reinforce 4 centuries of policing as a legal means of controlling and containing blacks in particular and other people of color. So we started out with police as slave patrollers, and then enforcers of the Jim Crow laws, then suppressors of the civil rights movement, and currently they're saboteurs of the movement to enforce or begin some police reform and accountability by doing interesting things like equating the protesters with international terrorists. And what Whren did was to validate ambiguous charges. So failing to maintain the lane. I put this in the list because of the Labor Day weekend, my own son, a 19-year-old who's a college student at Rider University in Lawrenceville, New Jersey, called and said, "Ma, I got stopped by the police." I said, "Really? What did you get stopped for?" He said, "Failing to maintain my lane." And I said, "Wow, that sounds pretty ambiguous." And he was questioned. The 2 passengers in his car were questioned. He was given a ticket for not changing his provisional license. Hopefully most people know what that is, right? When he was 17, he got a license. There are all kinds of restrictions. When you turn 18, those restrictions go away. He never bothered to go and change his license. And he got a ticket for having an expired insurance card. Now, neither one of those conditions would have been known if the officer hadn't stopped him. I ended up going to court with him, getting the 2 tickets dismissed, but the municipality still got $66 in court costs, which they would not have been able to get but for the ambiguous charge of failing to maintain his lane. By the way, he did not get a ticket for that. So things like failing to maintain the lane, following too closely, weaving, and driving erratically are all the kinds of conduct that can lead to a so-called valid police stop and lead to discovery of lesser or more serious crimes. And the question is always, it's the same question that was in Terry, what drew the police officer's attention to the person in the first place? So one of my favorite quotes comes from a case that came 1 year, not quite a full year, after the Whren decision, and that was Maryland versus Wilson, when the United States Supreme Court says that it is perfectly valid for the police to routinely ask passengers of stopped vehicles to get out of the vehicle. And I love the fact that Justice Kennedy, in his dissent, was bold enough to say, liberty comes not from officials by grace, but from the Constitution by right. But I think what I've seen in the last several years is this notion that not everyone subscribes to the belief that liberty is something that everyone is entitled to. So long as the police say we're acting for the purpose of producing public safety, all kinds of people, black people, white people, brown people, all kinds of people are willing to give over their liberty to the government, particularly in the form of law enforcement. And what's interesting is for those who push back and say, I don't want to be made safe by not having constitutional rights, the others think that they are being un-American. And so there's this strong tension that exists between people like myself who think of civil liberties as something that I'm entitled to, regardless of what I look like, and those who are willing to give up at least they think they're giving up their liberty for the purpose of safety. But we know that for black people in particular, black males specifically, that giving over of liberty can lead to their loss of life. And so it's an interesting way in which the public safety narrative has co-opted the notion of liberty as something to which someone is entitled. Yes. Okay. So ambiguity plus race equals harm. So Jonathan's going to talk more about the harms that come to racial and ethnic minorities when there is ambiguous enforcement of law supported by the United States Supreme Court, But the social psychologists, again, and I call your attention to this particular article by Stanford University professor Jennifer Eberhardt and her colleagues. It's called Seeing Black Race, Crime, and Visual Processing. In that piece, Dr. Eberhardt and her colleagues are able to empirically establish that we all see race, even when we think that we're colorblind, and she is able to work with neuroscientists that actually can show the physiological changes in the brain when we are presented with images that are outside our race. She's also able to establish that police officers and ordinary people do in fact associate black faces with criminality. And she talks about it's a bi-directional relationship, that when people see black faces, they think of crime. When they think of crime, they see black faces. And that concept is called implicit bias. Now, we know that Whren was a motor vehicle case, but Whren and policing of pedestrians has implications in two specific areas. Over the lunch break, I heard someone asking about broken windows policing. Broken windows policing is alive and well in New York City. William Bratton stands by broken windows policing as the way to keep crime down in the city. He and one of the Broken Windows founders, George Kelling, actually recently wrote a piece saying why we need broken windows policing. Now, what is windows policing? The notion that if you enforce, or law enforcement enforce, minor crime, that somehow, and I'm going to be facetious here, magically prevents serious crime and violent crime in the future. I heard the person over lunch say it's a discredited theory. I think there is a great debate among some criminologists whether it's discredited. I would be one of those who would agree that it's discredited. At the very least, it has not been empirically established. Before there was broken windows policing in New York City, Ray Kelly had a very lengthy period of enforcing stop and frisk aggressively, or the use of stop and frisk aggressively, and that was his magic bullet for keeping down crime in the city. So the notion that crime is a problem, our statistics suggest that crime is far less a problem now than it used to be, but the policing of certain communities, racial, ethnic, poor, urban communities, has actually gone up, even though crime has gone significantly down. And I'd ask you to show the next slide. So this is what stop and frisk policing looked like in New York City from 2003 to 2012. The notion is that overwhelmingly, the people who were being stopped as criminal suspects were black. The next slide. Even though the black population in New York City was relatively small. Now, the interesting thing is that while we see that 23% of the New York City population was black, and over 53% of those who were stopped were black. Next slide, please. In a Nightline interview in 2013, Commissioner Raymond Kelly said, so really African Americans are being understopped. And what he used to support that statement was a statement that 75% of violent crime in the city was committed by someone who's described as black, and only 53% of the people being stopped were black. Now, I don't know how many people 20 years ago would have heard that statement and not thought, wow, that's racist. So the fact that the commissioner was comfortable making a statement about black people as though they are a monolithic population was particularly troubling to me. So as I looked at the statistics that his own department produced, next slide please, about the association of blackness and violent crime, we found that, and we'll have to click it to get some numbers that'll come in. Press the button again. Okay, so 88% of the people who were stopped who were black in the city were not found to be involved in any kind of criminality. Next click. That if the most serious offense thought to be, keep clicking for me, thought to be engaged in, and we're looking at the 154 number if you can see it, which is homicide. A person was nearly 2,000 times more likely to be stopped, a black person that is, than to actually be a suspect in a homicide. Yet and still, the commissioner made this statement that blacks are understopped. The notion that a few number of people, if we look at the homicide figure, that's 154 black homicide suspects, that the behavior of 154 people would somehow then be used as a basis for judging the violent status of the rest of the people in the group. That's classic racism. But the commissioner felt comfortable going on national television and making that statement, I would suggest, because of decisions like Whren in Maryland versus Wilson, where in fact race was allowed to be part of the totality of the circumstances, or high crime area, or poor area, were the kinds of indicia of where crime occurs. And then it's also an indicator of the kinds of people who live there. And then, of course, the behavior of those people gets judged as potentially criminal based on the behavior of a few. Now, the idea was that the commissioner was in favor of stopping all these black people because it was keeping down crime. Next slide, please. But in fact, we found very little crime being detected during those stops. So almost no guns were found, although the policy was dubbed as a good means of good practice for recovering firearms. We found very few weapons were found. We found very few contraband of any kind found. And roughly 6% of stops resulted in an arrest or a summons being issued. But if we could go back one slide. Oop, just one. But we see what we see in terms of the racial impact of the practice on black people in the community. And so the justification that, again, we can find crime among black people because some of them are committing crime, and then the department's own statistics indicating that very little crime was being found, and the commissioner's adamance that, hey, we're not engaging in racial profiling because those who the criminals are, is problematic at best, right? Okay, go back to forward. Okay, now, the justification for the pedestrian stops were furtive movement. So remember, ambiguity plus race equals harms, right? So the most often cited reason for making a stop was furtive movement. What's a furtive movement? There's a gentleman there, he's got his hand near his face, he's acting furtively, and then he moved his eyebrows too, right? Okay. Being in a high crime area, right? So the notion of being in a place where crime is. Now, why would someone be in a high crime area? Maybe because that's the only place you can afford to live, because in a place like New York, everything else is too expensive to be able to, in too many other areas to be able to live in. Fits the description. Originally, that was a justification given for the racial disproportionality in stops. When the data was actually analyzed, we found that fits the description was very near the bottom of a reason for a stop. So the idea that because so many criminals are black, that's why we stopped so many black people wasn't really holding water. Time of day or night. How much more ambiguous can you get, right? Why would the time of day or night automatically make a person a criminal suspect? And this is one of my favorites. Wearing clothes / disguises commonly used in the commission of crime. This is actually on a police document called the UF 250 form as a reason for being able to stop someone. And it is part of the equation that led to 88% of innocent people who were black being stopped. Now, we were able to move on from Commissioner Ray Kelly to Commissioner Bill Bratton. And again, Commissioner Bill Bratton is adamant that broken windows policing reduces violent crime. So some of the offenses that amount to broken window offenses: riding a bicycle, next slide, on the sidewalk, having an open container, urinating in public, The marijuana situation was mentioned on the previous panel, and I overheard someone talking about jaywalking. That's also another broken windows offense. So somehow, by focusing on that kind of behavior, we're reducing violent crime in a city of 8.5 million people, and roughly 90% of the people that we're stopping are black or brown. Now, hopefully, none of this makes sense to you. And hopefully, we'll be able to have a discussion of why it was then and is now inappropriate to use race as an indicia of criminality. But cases like Whren and cases like Terry and cases like Maryland versus Wilson allows both overtly racist police officers and unconsciously racist police officers to continue to see black and brown people as presumptively criminal and dangerous. And we know that in the last 2 years, that has led to the death of people for allegedly selling cigarettes. It's a grown man, a father of family, a 12-year-old who's playing with a toy gun is dead. A young man walking down the stairs in a housing project is dead. A young man who apparently was walking in the street or allegedly was walking in the street is dead. What those victims all have in common is that they are black and they are male, and to allow any system or practice to be in place that exposes an individual at the risk of serious violence from a police officer or being criminalized, arrested, choked, and other harmful behavior by a police officer by virtue of the accident of birth is a situation that I'm hoping that we will all work together to change, to reform, to provide accountability for. Last slide. If you want to learn more about police community relations and policing practices, I ask you to visit our website, policingcommunity.org. It is an archive of public policy and empirical social science research on the impact of policing on communities of color, and specifically things like the use of stop and frisk and broken windows policing and the use of force. Thank you very much.
First of all, I'd like to thank Case Western for hosting this. I think it's a great event, and I think it's a very important one, and I'm honored to be here, and thank you for inviting me. Recent Black Lives Matter and similar protests in Baltimore, Ferguson, New York, and many other cities in this country are reminders that police departments are lacking legitimacy in the eyes of many of Americans. Some of this is no doubt historical, as police and communities of color have been in tension as long as they've coexisted. To this day, African Americans continue to have lower trust in law enforcement and more negative experience with police than non-Black Americans. Many attribute this phenomenon to racism, whether they are due to overt discrimination or implicit bias, as she was discussing. Racism certainly plays a role, but cases like Whren v. US point to a deeply troubling melange of process, legal fictions, and perverse incentives that undermine the perceptions of legitimacy of law enforcement, particularly for blacks. And it's up to the police themselves to restore that legitimacy with blacks and other minority communities in this country. I use the word legitimacy in the sense that people tend to follow the laws they respect, whether or not they particularly agree with them. After all, submission to law in society is for the most part a voluntary exercise. Society would break down if more than a small percentage of any given population paid little or no respect to the laws and customs of society. Of course, many people break laws all the time. Speeding, jaywalking, and other minor offenses are common occurrences. But of these, speeding, I think, is the most commonly enforced by police, and the traffic safety stops are the most common way any American generally deals with law enforcement, so I want to start my discussion there. Research by Professor Charles Epp and others from the University of Kansas suggests that there is little difference in dissatisfaction or bad feelings from drivers who are caught speeding when they believe that they were treated fairly. Despite levels of distrust that the relative levels of distrust that blacks feel towards police, Epps and company found that controlling for traffic safety stops, where the driver was unambiguously speeding and the stop was limited to the traffic safety enforcement purpose, did not contribute to negative reactions to the police across all races. What's more, researchers found that blacks and whites were stopped at similar rates for speeding and the like. What they did find was that pretextual investigatory stops, such as those condoned by Whren, contributed heavily to the police mistrust and ill will of African Americans. Their data, taken from sample of traffic stops in Kansas City, Missouri, published in their book Pulled Over, showed that white and black drivers generally felt the traffic safety stops were legitimate because they knew they were being pulled over for a legitimate purpose. However, when the stop was for a minor infraction that led to the police officer prying and asking questions and wanting to search the vehicle, the stops engendered hostility and resentment among African Americans who were stopped at much more frequency than for the investigatory purposes. In some of those encounters, drivers were kept for up to an hour, sometimes in handcuffs or with their hands spread on the hood of their cars as police searched their cars and other motorists drove by. Given that the people most often subjected to these denigrating and investigative searches, both in automobiles and pedestrian Terry stops, are African Americans, one can understand why blacks trust the police at much lower rates than whites. A majority of black drivers Epps surveyed knew someone or had their own personal negative experiences with police. Many of these stories are legal by every definition, and therefore, but they were nevertheless invasive, unpleasant, but for which they had no legal recourse. Many blacks who are stopped understand or believe that the potential cost of saying no to an officer could result in officer agitation, which could end up in handcuffs or obviously something worse. Under these circumstances, while consent is voluntarily given in the legal sense in the eyes of the law, it doesn't feel that way to the people necessarily giving it. It is important to remember that Whren is just one case among a group of Fourth Amendment cases, as we've been discussing, particularly Terry, that have basically made consent to be an illusion. An opinion that was, Terry, of course, was an opinion that was meant to provide a rarely used officer safety exception to the Fourth Amendment, and it has morphed into a virtual carte blanche for stopping individuals on the streets in many major cities. In a recent concurrence in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, Judge Janice Rogers Brown wrote about this recurring problem in Fourth Amendment jurisprudence. The case involved patrols of officers called gun recovery units, and they patrolled predominantly black and high-crime neighborhoods in D.C. She provided a thought experiment in which she decided, well, how about we imagine this scene in Georgetown? For those not familiar with D.C., it is a Tony shopping district and affluent white neighborhood. She writes, would residents of that neighborhood maintain that there was no pressure to comply if the district's police officers patrolled Prospect Street in tactical gear, questioning each person they encountered about whether they were carrying an illegal firearm? Nothing about the gun recovery unit's modus operandi is designed to convey a message that compliance is not required. While viewing such an encounter as consensual is roughly equivalent to finding the latest Sasquatch sighting credible, I submit to the prevailing orthodoxy, but I continue to reject its counterintuitive premise. She goes on to say, with the guise of voluntary consent stripped away, the reality of the district's regime is revealed. It is a rolling roadblock that sweeps citizens up at random and subjects them to undesired police interactions culminating in the search of their persons and effects. If a Fourth Amendment is intended to offer meaningful protection in the context of Terry stops, then voluntary consent exemption cannot be used to engage members of the public en masse and at random to fabricate articulable suspicions for virtually every citizen officer's encounter on patrol. Judge Brown was bound by Supreme Court precedent to uphold these stops, but her opinion of the socioeconomic and racial double standard that applies in these situations could not be clearer. There's a large amount of research that suggests that what is known as procedural justice can mitigate some of the rancor elicited by police encounters, whether in traffic or pedestrian stops. That is, if a police officer treats the subject with respect and fairness, the person who is stopped will accept the legitimacy of the stop much more likely, regardless of the outcome, even if the outcome is arrest or ticketing. But it's very important to remember that procedural justice should be considered for the entirety of the stop, not just whether the officer was friendly or polite after pulling someone over. The biggest problem, I think, in the way that procedural justice is often thought of is that it concentrates too often on just the interaction between the officer and the subject. It doesn't take into consideration the stop in and of itself, why someone was pulled over. As Dr. Jones-Brown mentioned, when a person is stopped in a black neighborhood with high drug activity or violence that is a racial component, um, most people who live in those neighborhoods are not, in fact, drug offenders or criminals, but they're being stopped primarily for their proximity to drug and violent crimes. This undermines the expectation of individualized suspicion that our Fourth Amendment is supposed to protect us against. People who defend the practice of investigatory stops admit that most people who are stopped are in fact innocent, but that dire circumstances in those neighborhoods call for aggressive measures. That there is scant statistical evidence that these stops reduce crime is less often mentioned. Other times, the area where a black driver is stopped is in an affluent white neighborhood. Here, the investigatory stop of drivers often start with, "Where are you going? Why are you here?" And this imposition and the unsubtle implication that black people do not belong in certain areas harkens back to a darker time in America's past in which blacks were viewed not as full citizens by either law or custom. As a nation, we have destroyed the racially discriminatory laws, but in some ways, many of our law enforcement customs maintain the racial divisions within our society. Whether an investigatory stop happens in a black neighborhood or a white one, the pretext for a stop plausibly has that racial component. The less legitimate the initial reason for the stop, the less likely the driver will view the stop as a legitimate exercise of police power, and the less legitimacy that police agency is going to have in the eyes of that person and whoever they complain to. An officer who is conducting a pretextual stop has usually been trained to ask questions that will lead to a search. That officer has also likely been trained to ask for consent, sometimes in ways that play fast and loose with the truth. Broadly put, courts have determined that a certain amount of deception is legal so long as it is not to directly deprive the rights of individual. But the person being goaded and deceived is more often than not disinterested in case law. Professor Christopher Slobogin, relying on the philosophy of Cicely Bach, has written on the ethics rather than the legality of police lying under different circumstances. He concludes that insofar as police should ever lie, it should be done after the person has been arrested or that the police have established and have probable cause to arrest the person, such as to elicit a confession from a murder suspect. In this circumstance, establishing a person's position relative to law enforcement as a putative lawbreaker clarifies the relationship as a potentially antagonistic one, and the need for mutual trust is lessened. By definition, using deception to gain consent to a car search is employed only when the officers lack the probable cause to suspect criminal activity. Such lies subvert the principle and spirit of the Fourth Amendment protections. Moreover, using trickery and deceit to elicit cooperation of a driver or person suspected of no crime shifts an officer's role from protector and public servant to that of antagonist and interrogator, even if he is doing so politely. Black people who experience these stops, particularly those who experience it repeatedly, recognize the difference and often resent it. Indeed, it is hard to imagine trusting a group of people who lie to you to get you to waive your constitutional rights just because they think you're out of place. Unfortunately, fixing the legitimacy problem isn't as simple as weeding racist and prejudiced officers out of police departments, even if doing so were simple, which of course it isn't. There are systemic incentives at play that allow and encourage these practices to proliferate. These incentives continue to sow the seeds of distrust between communities, and particularly minority communities. The effect of these incentives is an erosion of police and criminal law legitimacy, and the social cohesion that is essential for a community to thrive and prosper. These incentives include, first and foremost, the prosecution of the drug war. Discussing Whren in particular, whatever putative utility investigatory stops provide virtually disappears outside of the framework of the war on drugs. Contraband seizures look good on arrest reports, and major scores look great for cameras. But those busts say nothing about the humiliating experiences of countless innocent people before finding that one car full of drugs and guns. But because millions of Americans of all races and economic strata use drugs each month, the potential for catching someone with drugs, cash, firearms, or paraphernalia that facilitate the drug trade is much greater than, say, stolen property from a burglary or other clearly criminal evidence that might be uncovered in a traffic stop. And because the drug trade is so lucrative, and not just for dealers, but also the enforcers through confiscation, asset forfeiture, and other federal incentives, limited police resources are steered towards drug enforcement and away from public safety and crime solving. The second major incentive is arrest or citation as metric for police success. Whether or not there is an unofficial quota, officers will tend to maximize arrests for arrest's sake. Again, the drug war becomes a primary driver of this arrest due to America's considerable drug appetite. But beyond that, broken window style policing leads to crackdowns on loiterers, gray market tobacco sales, truancy, and other minor offenses, several of which have racist origins in the post-Civil War South. Aggressive order enforcement has always and continues to fall disproportionately on Black Americans. It sometimes manifests itself as harassment, leading to dramatic confrontations like we saw in Staten Island that ultimately led to the death of Eric Garner. More broadly, zero tolerance policing disrupts the lives of minor offenders and adds to their criminal records, making them less employable and less viable in a market economy. Fewer legal opportunities make reoffending more likely and trapping people in a spiral of petty crime and incarceration. The third incentive, as the late William Stuntz lamented in his book, The Collapse of American Criminal Justice, is the political pressure for aggressive policing, the fears of a wider and wider electorate that results in punitive measures mostly meted out on minority communities. The illusion of fairness is bolstered by skewed perceptions of the nature of police interactions and procedural guarantees of the Supreme Court. Never mind that the opinions such as Whren and Terry often undermine the very rights they are meant to protect when applied in practice. Taken together, you have a system that rewards enforcement, not justice, and a democratic check against abuse that is concentrated in areas that do not feel the direct effects of enforcement. This is a recipe for ignorance and tolerance of police abuse. Ultimately, it is up to the police to establish trust with the communities they are sworn to protect and serve. Absent a sea change in Fourth Amendment jurisprudence, police agencies and legislators will need to reorient law enforcement priorities and strategies to better serve communities that need their protection the most. This is no small task. Policymakers will need to redefine the goals and methods of policing. Professors Cynthia Lum and Daniel Nagin of Carnegie Mellon have a forthcoming paper that discusses two new focuses for policing in the 21st century. The first is that crime reduction and not arrest should drive police evaluations for both police department and for police officers individually. The second principle is that sorry, I forgot my last piece of paper. The second principle is that whatever the crime is, excuse me a second. The second principle is that whatever policy that the police choose has to be tied to the community that it's being policed, that it's being used in. For example, pretextual stops may in fact get more drugs off the street, but the fact of the matter is that people are suffering from this tactic, and it is not responsive to the communities in which it's being employed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank, first and foremost, my fellow panelists for a scholarly and thoughtful presentation. I appreciate that. The one thing I want to point to, however, is the elephant that's not in the room today. For a day-long discussion of the most serious and troubling flaws in police work, we have a diligent libertarian researcher and 10 professors, if you count all the panels, who spent years building their scholarship, but no one who spent any time as a policeman. The best the cat has been able to drag in is me, an over-the-hill appellate lawyer who never dealt with local or state police, and I haven't even been a prosecutor since the last millennium. So our discussion is certainly important and enlightening in a number of respects, but it is not balanced. We all have questions about why the police act as they do. Perhaps the best thing to do is invite one in to tell us. Nonetheless, even an aging litigator like me has a few observations. In making them, I want to acknowledge both my limitations and my sources, as I would do in an academic paper. When I was asked to participate in this symposium, I had to do some reading, so there might be a prayer that I have something useful to say. And much of what I have been thinking about and will say today comes from Heather McDonald, who works for the City Journal in New York City, Kevin Williamson of the National Review, and Jason Riley, who's a particularly good columnist for the Wall Street Journal. The thing I want to start out talking to you about is a case that I actually do know about personally, and it's the first time that race kind of arrived in the middle of my plate when I was a federal prosecutor. The case is named Olvis versus United States. It's a 97 Fed 3rd 739. It was a 1996 case in the Fourth Circuit. The named defendant is Tony Olvis, and you did not want to mess with Tony Olvis. The way the case came to our attention in the U.S. Attorney's Office was that a group of community, civic, and business leaders in Williamsburg, Virginia, where this crack ring was going on, came to the office wanting to see if we would do something about it. The office's initial reaction was that Williamsburg is a relatively small and isolated part of the state, even though it tends to be a tourist destination, and that this did not have sufficient interstate nexus to be something that we were going to spend federal money on doing because it's too localized. And we went back and forth with a community group that came in to meet with us, every one of whom was black, because this ring was operating in part of the town that was where the residents were almost all black. Anyway, at the end of the meeting, we decided we still weren't going to take the case, explaining our budgetary concerns, and the leader of this group, again, a black gentleman, said something that has been resonating in my head ever since. He said, well, I understand that you have a limited budget, but I don't think that's the real problem here. The real problem is that people like you don't care about people like us. What he meant by that is that you highfalutin Justice Department people with your Stanford degrees and your Brooks Brothers suit have no idea what it's like to have a toehold in the middle class, trying to operate a business, trying to get somewhere, trying to make the same life for our family that white people have made for theirs for a long time, and have it become impossible because our neighborhoods aren't safe. They're so dangerous that people won't come into our stores. You don't care about people like us. That's where I started to think seriously about this, really for the first time, I have to confess. The subject of our symposium today is stated as distrust of the police use of targeting and proactive tactics, and the putative result in handicapping, one of the results, handicapping the fight against crime. There are three components in that subject. Is there distrust of the police? Is it growing after Whren? And has it handicapped our efforts to suppress crime? Let me take them one at a time. Is there distrust? Mostly not. There is not distrust compared to other institutions of government. This question has actually been polled. Gallup has been polling it since the year that Whren was arrested, 1993. In that year, trust of the police was rated at 52%. Now, that may not sound like much, except when you find out that of the 15 government institutions the poll asked about, the police were number 3. They ranked just behind the military and small business. In the last poll on this, while the police, again, had 52%, the U.S. Supreme Court had 32%, The presidency had 33%, and TV news had 21%. Relative to other institutions in our culture, the police are actually more trusted by a considerable margin. Is distrust growing after Whren? No, it isn't. The level was 52% in 1993 when this question was first asked by Gallup, and it's 52% today. In the interim, distrust of the police fell for the next 10 years, and trust in the police rose from 93 to 2003. I think probably trust in the police artificially spiked after the police and firefighters' response to the 9/11 attacks. The highest it has reached in the last 20 years was 64%, and it has fallen off in the last 10 years, but it's the same now as it was when Whren was arrested. And third, has it handicapped our efforts to suppress crime? Well, the logical precedent to that is whether our efforts to suppress crime have been handicapped at all. And the crime statistics would indicate strongly that they have not been. As one of our prior panelists has mentioned, crime has actually fallen considerably. Over the last 20 years, it's fallen by half. If the reaction to Whren has handicapped our efforts, it's a handicap that has an odd effect. For the last year, the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been mentioned, has indeed roiled the discussion that we are continuing today. It was triggered by the 2014 police shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the movement holds, so far as I can read it, that police are a racist threat, and possibly the gravest racist threat facing black young men today. I do not agree with this view. In my view, there is no government agency more than the police that, after the rhetoric has ended, actually and on the ground reality we have seen for a generation of dwindling violent crime saves more black lives than proactive police work. It goes without saying that the police have an obligation to treat everyone with decency and respect. Every unjustified use of force against a civilian is at least a tragedy and possibly a crime in which I would be interested, and I was interested when I was a prosecutor. Given the history of racism in America and the complicity of the police in that history, police shootings of black men are particularly fraught. Every time a white person with a conscience hears of one, a troubling sense that feels like shame must seep up from within. But there is a larger taboo reality behind the issues of policing crime and race. It's a taboo that I am not going to honor today, and I can't honor if I'm to be straight with you. The reality is this: unless the problem of the enormous level of black-on-black crime is acknowledged, it is impossible fairly to understand the patterns in police behavior we see today, much less to change them in ways we wouldn't soon come to regret. Every year, approximately 6,000, it's probably more than that, black people are murdered. This is a number greater than the number of white and Hispanic murder victims combined, even though blacks are only 12% of the population. Blacks of all ages are killed at a rate 6 times the rate of whites and Hispanics. Here is the ugly truth: the black homicide victimization rate is a function of the black crime rate. Black males, in particular between the ages of 14 and 17, commit homicide at a rate 10 times the rate of white and Hispanic male teens combined. The police could end all lethal uses of force tomorrow, both justified and unjustified, and it would have at most a trivial effect on the black death rate. According to the FBI, the police kill somewhat more than 400 people a year, a third of them black. Some estimates put the police killings at twice that number, but even if the more florid estimates are accepted as correct, the proportion of black shooting fatalities remains 1/3. Homicide is the most prominent but not the only crime that is vastly racially disproportionate. New York City, in that respect, is representative of other crime that unfortunately is spreading across the country and has been since late spring. Blacks are 23% of New York's population, but commit 75% of all shootings, 70% of all robberies, and 66% of all violent crime, according to the victims of and witnesses to those crimes, who are themselves overwhelmingly black. Whites are 33% of the city's population, but they commit less than 2% of all shootings, 4% of all robberies, and 5% of all violent crimes. These disparities mean something. They mean that virtually every time the police are called out after a shooting, they are being summoned to minority neighborhoods and looking for minority suspects. Meanwhile, the victims of elevated urban crime are rarely commemorated. On March 11th of this year, as protesters were converging on Ferguson Police Headquarters demanding the resignation of the entire department, a 6-year-old boy named Marcus Johnson was killed a few miles away in St. Louis, the victim of a stray bullet fired in a drug dispute. 3 children under the age of 6 have been shot to death in this city in the last 5 weeks. Crime rates were much higher 20 years ago. In New York City in 1990, for example, there were 2,262 homicides. Last year, there were 333, a drop of 85%. New York's crime drop is the steepest in the country, but crime has fallen at an historic rate nationwide as well, nearly 50% since the early 1990s. The key point is this: the greatest beneficiaries of the drop in crime have been minorities, and minorities will get hit first and worst when it starts back up. More than 10,000 minority males are alive today in New York who would be dead if the city's homicide rate had remained at the early 1990s levels. The crime decrease across the country and in New York is a result of many things, most of which will be unpopular with this group. Putting more criminals in jail for longer is one of the causes. The aging of the most crime-prone component of the population, another. More effective private security measures. And most importantly for our purposes, very substantial changes in policing, including aggressive and proactive policing. Police now systematically gather and analyze up-to-the-minute crime data and devise proactive tactics accordingly. For decades, the rap against the police was that they ignored crime in minority neighborhoods. Policing now keeps departments focused on where people are most frequently being victimized, and that is in those neighborhoods. The other factor that determines where police are deployed is community demands for assistance and enforcement. That was the point of my story about Tony Olvis. Go to any police community meeting in an urban area, and you will invariably find some variant on the following requests. We want the dealers off the corner. The kids are hanging out, menacing me on my stoop. Why don't you arrest them? I smell weed in the hallway. Can't you do something? The irony is that the police cannot respond to these simple and common sense requests from people who want nothing more than to live in peace and safety without generating the racially disproportionate statistics that will be used against them in an ACLU or Justice Department lawsuit. We're obligated by law, not to mention basic decency, to do everything we can to ensure that police departments use force only as a last resort. But as long as crime rates are so racially disproportionate, policing is going to be more intense in black neighborhoods, increasing the chances that when an encounter goes awry, it will have a black victim. This does not change the reality. Proactive policing is the most effective government program we know to regenerate deteriorating urban neighborhoods to free their law-abiding residents from fear and disorder, and ensure that Black lives not only matter, but are saved from the fate violent crime so much more frequently visited upon them only a generation ago, and will blight them again if, allowing anger to displace discipline and judgment, we now lose our nerve.
Panelists for those insightful comments and thoughtful presentations. We have time now for questions, and there are mics in the room. I'm going to ask our law students to keep track of who is next when you hand off the mic, okay?
Can I respond to my panelists here before we go to the floor?
Absolutely, definitely.
So I'm a prosecutor in a previous life, so I have worked closely with police officers. I teach at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. That means I have probably educated about 1,500 sworn police officers in a special program that we have that was designed to help police understand their role in a multicultural society. I have met some of the most decent human beings I've ever wanted to meet in that program. Many of those human beings have complained themselves about the way that policing is being done in the city. I think it is unfortunate that we dismiss data that is individualized. For example, that 154 homicides that were in my slide of violent crimes committed by Black people, but there were nearly 300,000 Black people stopped. And so when we start talking about percentages and rates, we totally miss the point that Black people and all other people are individuals. And when we start talking about churchgoers, business owners, homeowners, and the employed, we dismiss the people who are law-abiding, but they don't go to church. They're law-abiding, but they don't own businesses. They're law-abiding, but they're not homeowners. And they're law-abiding, and they're not employed. And so I think what we want to be mindful of is that Black people are not interchangeable. Then when white crime happens, it's typically committed by white people. In 2011, the last set of statistics that are available on the internet, there were roughly 4,000 homicide offenders who were white, roughly 4,000 homicide offenders who were Black, and the victims of each look like the perpetrators. So to have a one-sided discussion that talks about Black on Black crime and doesn't look at white on white crime is disingenuous, and we should not participate in that kind of a discussion.
Okay. So,
One thing, I couldn't agree more that people need to be looked at as individuals. I actually had a problem participating in this debate, not just because I'm old and over the hill. I had a problem participating in it because its premise is to talk about people as members of a race. And I couldn't agree more that they should be dealt with as individuals, both as crime victims, as criminals, as police officers, as prosecutors and defense lawyers. I absolutely agree with that.
So thank you both. We're going to open the comments, and if I could get the folks with mics to pay attention to who is next in the queue. And once you have raised your hand and gotten the microphone, remember to speak into it. Thank you. Okay. Professor Harris, you're first.
Thank you. Great panel. I have a couple of things I'd like to say by way of response to Mr. Otis. Number one, I want to really thank you for pointing out that there's no law enforcement here. I think that's actually a very good point, and it's important to get a full picture, and I think you've done a very good job of bringing some of that, so I appreciate it. I do have a couple of points of disagreement with you, though. When you talk about the trust issue, it's not that trust in police isn't pretty good and better than many other government institutions. It's the gap in trust that is fairly solid over time. You will find whites and blacks have a very different idea of whether or not they trust police. Now, both are still actually relatively high, given what we might expect in today's climate, but that gap is potentially very dangerous because it makes it more difficult to create public safety. And that's where I think the attention should be. Number two, a lot of your remarks, I think, are premised on the idea that there is only one good way to fight crime, black on black, white on white, whatever, and that is through proactive policing, which is certainly appropriate in some circumstances, but it is clearly something that leaves it's a method that is not appropriate to all circumstances and can lead to some very bad outcomes too, especially considering, point number three, there are other ways of successfully fighting crime that don't involve the kind of proactive jump out of the car sort of ways of doing things. Next point, and I promise to be brief with this, blacks as the greatest beneficiaries, minorities as the greatest beneficiaries of this sort of policing. Of the crime rate coming down. This is true. So I ask, in the words of Zach Carter, who was the Eastern District of New York's U.S. Attorney, why isn't there a great love affair in New York between the black community and the NYPD? And clearly there isn't. I don't think you can blame that on Black Lives Matter or any other kind of protests. It's the lived experience, I think, that people have as individuals. They don't feel that this is necessarily being done to serve them. It is being done to them. And therefore, the benefit that they may undoubtedly be getting is not perceived in the same way that you might expect. Last, your point on black crime, sure, pay attention to it. It's real. There is no denying the reality of that in the statistics, but I don't think that means that we don't talk about police violence or police legitimacy when that can be avoided too. We can handle more than one thing at a time. Those are my comments and questions.
Do you want to respond?
Yeah, sure. Taking the last one first, the first case that I had in the Court of Appeals was against 4 white policemen. Actually, the very first case that I had, they were shaking down a drug dealer for part of his profits. I started off at Main Justice in Washington, D.C., rather than the U.S. Attorney's Office. It was a case you will not be surprised to hear in Chicago, where the police and the entire city government is rotten through and through. I'm under no illusions about the corruption of public institutions, the police and others. I think the drop in crime, you talked about, well, there should be a love affair because crime has dropped dramatically. I mean, it's in my mind, the most underreported story of the last generation is the drop in crime. The government does a lot of things. I agree with the Cato Institute that many things the government does just cost a huge amount of money and they're ineffective or counterproductive. The war on crime has actually been one program that worked. And as I say, there are a number of reasons it's worked, and I agree with you that proactive policing is only one of them. There are some others that I mentioned, some of which have to do with changes in institutional behavior and some of which do not. I tend to go with what works. We have seen with the dramatic drop in crime over the last generation, of which minorities disproportionately benefit because they are disproportionately the victims of crime. One of the things that works is more systematic and proactive policing. It is, you're quite right, that's not the only solution, but it has been part of the solution. And to get to the first thing you said, it's true that there is a gap between black trust in the police and white trust in the police. It's actually considerable, according to Gallup, it was about 20%. The reason that I mention it for purposes of this forum is that we're talking here about the effect of Whren and the ripples of Whren through law enforcement culture after it was decided. And the gap now between whites and blacks is the same as it's always been so far. so far as the polling shows. So, yes, there is a gap, but if Whren changed it, the polling doesn't show that.
One practical and one theoretical point that might be helpful. I'm a professor at Baldwin Wallace, so I think I can speak up in Case Western's defense as to Professor Otis's first point. We did, in fact, there was a wonderful Terry v. Ohio anniversary presentation in this room, and it was populated mostly by law enforcement personnel who talked at great length about the difficulties that law enforcement face in their Terry frisks and in all of those kinds of stop and frisk situations, Terry stops. It was fascinating to see what they go through, and it was fascinating to hear their points of view. So I think that perhaps if we could get those two groups together and meet in the same place or same space, it could be a very interesting thing. But nonetheless, I would recommend seeing that if you can. I think it's still on YouTube, and it's a wonderful talk on Terry v. Ohio. The second theoretical point is that Professor Jones-Brown, I was actually, I think, commenting on a point that I was making with Professor Harris about broken windows theory. I think we share a very similar educational background. I think we're probably the only JD PhDs in the room. As far as broken windows theory goes, though, small point of refinement, I think we both agree that it's discredited, I think, pretty much.
Oh, yes, I'm in the discredited camp.
But kind of key point here is that broken windows theory is not actually arguing that small crime should be stopped because it leads to serious crime, saying that disorder should be nipped in the bud because disorder leads to serious crime. And disorder is then broken down into two types. You've got physical disorder of a community, and that's where you're talking about vacant buildings and broken windows and things like vacant trash lots. And then you've got social disorder, which is even murkier, right? Which is this idea of aggressive panhandling, noisy neighbors, and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So my comments to Professor Harris were the reason that this is so discredited is that it would be one thing to have something measurable like small crimes leading to larger crimes. It's another thing to have a theory that's so mushy and so ambiguous, this idea of disorder, that includes categories of behavior that are both legal and illegal, and lumping them all together. So I felt like I could jump in on that. It's more of a comment since we were kind of having an ongoing conversation. But thank you very much.
Other questions?
Hello. For about the past year, I've been attending police and community events, and one problem that I noticed is that when there are community events with the police in the community, specifically talking about minorities and race and things like that, most of the time there is a diverse police crowd, but one of the issues is that when talking about issues about race, the white police officers typically they do not like to answer the question, so they give the microphone, they'll pass it to the black police officers to respond to questions about race because they're uncomfortable. And if we're uncomfortable talking about race, how can we fix it? The black police officers give their answer, and unless someone specifically says, can someone else answer the question, they will not, saying that, well, my sergeant, my friend, he can answer it better than I can. So, and another one of my questions is for Mr. Otis. Your statistics on violent crimes. While these statistics are true, there are also violent crimes that are predominantly committed majority by white males, such as domestic violence and child pedophilia. However, it would be outrageous to take those statistics and police a whole group of people by that crime. But it's reasonable to police black people because black people commit certain crimes at certain levels. But we would never think about doing that same thing to white people, specifically to white men, as we police black men. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
Yeah, let me answer the question.
Okay, let me respond to her first part of the question. So the discomfort in talking about race is a very real issue, or the sort of picking camps when we want to talk about race. One of the most honest essays that I received from a white police officer who was my student was that when he was recruited to the NYPD, he and his friend prayed that they wouldn't get certain assignments as their first assignments. and he and his friend both got an urban minority poor community to police. His friend quit the force, which I thought was probably the most legitimate and honest thing to do because he knew that he wasn't prepared for that situation. But this young man who had grown up in a planned all-white community, which he didn't learn about that until he came to my class, that his community was a planned all-white community, when he arrived in Brownsville, Brooklyn, said he thought he had landed on another planet. He said there was nothing in his lived experience that prepared him to police in Brownsville. And that level of honesty needs to be more pronounced within all discussions of policing because he was able to say things that some of his colleagues were feeling. And the question is, why did he feel that way? Partly was race, partly was socioeconomics, partly it was the urbanization of the community where he was policing. And it is that combination of things that makes it really important to keep in mind when we're talking about crime rates as opposed to black on black crime, okay? And how we move forward to a place where we can speak genuinely about the racial impacts of our lived experiences and our ability to interact with other people becomes really important. And I think that a panel like this helps us get there, but using rates of anything actually causes us not to be able to move forward. Because at the end of the day, it's about our common humanity, and no one of us has a monopoly on how anyone, individual or group should live. And we are not a monolith, no matter who we are. And unfortunately, the kinds of presentations, I know Ms. McDonald very well, she's not a social scientist, she's not an empiricist. And when she talks about crime rates, it's talked about in a way that's divisive. And I don't think we get to where we need to be in looking at the common human process of policing when we do that.
I'm very grateful for the preamble to your question. And I very much agree with it. And I'm sure that some of the things I said in my presentation made some people in this room unhappy and maybe made them wonder about my motives or the motives of people who agree with me in this debate. One of the reasons that I accepted this invitation, although I'm mostly unqualified to talk about local policing since I was a Fed and really didn't work with the police, is I think exactly as you do that a white person who is pro-law enforcement and is sympathetic to the police, even while not being that familiar with the details of what they do, has to show up at forums like this. And so I did so, even confessing, as I have a number of times, that this was not my area. As to your question as to whether society would tolerate it if we had the degree and the intensity of policing among whites that exists among blacks, my answer to that is the police go where the complaints are. People call in complaints, and where disproportionately complaints come from the black communities, because black communities bear the disproportionate brunt of crime, and that's why the police go where they go.
And can I just make the point again that Black communities and Latino communities have been complaining about policing in their communities for quite some time, and it's not getting the kind of proactive response until fairly recently that it needs to get. In New York City, because a retired tennis pro was thrown to the ground by a police officer on camera, the NYPD in January will begin a new set of policies on the use of force. But ordinary black people and brown people have been complaining about the police use of force in their communities for some time. And so that raises a really interesting ethical question. Why is it that for the 10, 20, 30 years that black and brown communities were complaining about police behavior, no affirmative stance was taken until a famous black person was caught on camera being mishandled by the police?
First of all, thank you to all the panelists. It's a privilege to be able to attend this variety of perspectives and all very informative. I think we all recognize that this is a problem, and hopefully we're looking for solutions. So my question is, are there, for all the panelists, are there instances you know of where diverse, relatively high crime communities have gone from poor police relationships with the community to maybe good relationships between police and the community? And if so, what do people attribute that change to? Thank you.
I was recently at a conference in which a former officer at Charlotte, North Carolina, was discussing, and he said that before there was a regime change in the police department, anytime there was a use of force, there was there didn't seem to be a reaction from the police department that was commensurate with what happened, and the community did not trust the police very much. And recently there was a police-involved shooting, and because the culture of the police-community relationship had switched around in the past, I think it was 5 to 8 years. When the police came to them and said this is what happened, there wasn't the outcry that there had been in the past. They had a more open dialogue with their police department. They had they showed more transparency with the incident, whereas very often you see police-involved shootings where everything's clamped down and they leak information to discredit whoever was shot and that sort of thing. And I think it's that sort of thing can happen, but it requires a lot of change on the part of transparency on police departments.
There's only one instance that I know of myself, and that is, and it's not directly responsive to your question. After we did do the Tony Olvis case and sent Tony and 29 of his co-conspirators to federal prison for a considerable length of time, I don't know what the relationship between the local police in Williamsburg and the black community there was, but I do know that there arrived in the mail one day a package for me, and it was a plaque of appreciation from the people who had come to meet me and earlier said that I didn't care about people like them. And that plaque hangs in my office today and reminds me every day of the relations that can exist between the authorities and the black community.
So I testified before President Barack Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force, and when I testified, I used San Diego as the example. San Diego brought down crime and some of the violent crimes to levels lower than those that were accomplished in New York City during the 90s, and they used something called neighborhood policing approach. In the neighborhood policing approach, the police asked the community what it was that they saw as the crime problem that they wanted the police to address. And I've talked with some folks who were with the department during that time, and there was some disagreement. What the police thought was the major problem, because there's something called problem-oriented policing, the community didn't necessarily think that that was what the major problem was. But the police responded both to what they thought was the problem and what the community thought was the problem. Most recently, when the protests began to take place around the Black Lives Matter movement issues, San Diego, on Martin Luther King Day, actually sponsored the protests and worked with the community to make sure it was a nice, orderly, but effective, impactful opportunity for the people of the community to express their disagreement.
I'd like to thank the panelists for their very interesting and very thoughtful comments and insights. I had a question relative, well, I had many, but in regards to Mr. Otis's comments, but particularly I wanted to get your response to the comment that you made that police go where the complaints are. In your preliminary comments, you had talked about the black on black homicide in particular. As we know, the majority of all homicides are intraracial, as Dr. Jones-Brown accurately pointed out. Also, in the last panel, I posed a question regarding the current heroin epidemic, and and I'd like to get your thoughts relative to your comment about the police going where the complaints are. We know this current heroin epidemic is primarily affecting white America. And just as the majority of homicides are intraracial, the research data clearly shows the majority of drug sales are also intraracial. So therefore, I'd like to get your comments regarding policing to address this current drug epidemic. And do you see race as being a factor? And will we see a continuation of this type of policing we've seen under the prior war on drugs regime?
Again, I don't know the answer that would be directly responsive to your question, but I do know one thing. Drug crimes, although they result in thousands of deaths, the number of overdose deaths in this country has quadrupled in the last 10 years. There were 8,200 heroin overdose deaths last year, and there are going to be more this year. But drug crimes are in their own category so far as enforcement goes, because drug crimes are consensual. That is, what is going on are consensual sales. In heroin, what is going on is that the buyer is not only consenting, he's eager. As a matter of fact, he's desperate, because they become addicts and they become desperate for it. And where you have a consensual crime, then of course, the buyer, the addict, is not going to report his source to the police, because in his addiction, he thinks that his life depends on getting the next hit. The reality is that thousands of times his life will be ended by the next hit. But the reporting of crime, the number of complaints and drug crimes are a completely different category from other crimes.
I'd like to take a stab at that. Yeah. I think in any drug prohibition regime, you're going to see an increase in violence as enforcement goes down. Obviously, the president and other law enforcement agents in the DOJ have talked about increasing trafficking interdiction when it comes to heroin. The prison population has, and the drug offenders has gone up among white people. The movie called House I Live In featured a prison guard talking about how the number of white people coming in for drug charges was shooting up, and it was because of meth, but heroin is also making a rise. Anytime you're going to have enforcement, it's going to make the drug harder to get. When the drug is harder to get, the people who are selling it are going to be fighting over it, and there's going to be violence that spills over. So yes, I expect to see violence coming down. That is going to be, more white people are going to be involved, but it's just going to be the major suppliers that are going to be fighting over territory and such.
But Dr. Dunn, I think you're asking a different question. It's a question that's come up in New York. The antidote for heroin overdose is now carried on the utility belt of every NYPD officer. When heroin was seen as a black drug, that wasn't necessarily the case. So it seems that the law enforcement response to heroin use today, with the population that appears to be primarily white and more middle class, is extremely different than the police response to urban minority poor people's use of heroin in the past.
Thank you. Thank you. This question is for Dr. Jones-Brown. in response to some things that Mr. Otis stated. Um, in your slides, you began with a narrative on the history of the police with slave codes, enforcing Jim Crow, et cetera. And we know from a historical narrative that with the advent of slavery also came this narrative that came out of quote unquote scholarly research about the criminality of black males in particular, but black people in general. And if you could kind of talk about the policing of black people and the policing of black bodies, but also talk about how this idea of so-called black on black crime and how this crime is somewhat tied to black people, but how people who first arrived in this country, their crime in their communities were, well, actually, let me rephrase that. The question I'm really asking is, can you talk about when race was first broken down in crime and why that started, why that happened?
Okay, so I'm going to go one better. I'm going to give a magnificent source that if you have not read Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad's book, The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, you absolutely must read it. It's a Harvard University Press book from, let's say it's 2011. He won, he's an historian, and he runs the Schomburg Center on Black Culture in New York City, part of the New York Public Library system. He won an award in history for the book. So the notion is that for as long as we have, in the United States, had African slavery, we have tried to trace or associate criminality with blackness, but we know that the first arriving European ethnics, there were various European ethnics that were seen as a criminal class: the Irish, the Italian, the Jews, the Germans. Before there was whiteness, there was European ethnicity, and there were criminal classes that were all seen, or various ones seen as criminals. The creation of criminality for black people, beginning with being a runaway slave, and that's why this slide begins with the slave patrollers, okay? We're a nation built on liberty, but if you ran away as an African slave, you were a criminal. People were paid to return those people as criminals. Anyone who harbored a runaway, a slave, a person seeking liberty, was a criminal. And it was punished both by federal and state and local laws. And so, but that's a history that we've sort of forgotten. Professor Muhammad also talks about the fact that when we look at criminal statistics every year, arrest statistics every year, 70% of arrestees are white, 30% are black. But we spend so much attention on that 30%. And what I say to my students is, I said, if it were money, which would you rather have, the $70 or the $30? And they always say the 70. So why is it that not only do we spend so much time looking at the 30% and ignoring the 70%, except for perhaps those few offenses that you talked about, okay? Why is it? How are we socially attuned to doing that? And we say, oh, but they make up 12% of the population, 30% of the restee population. But at the end of the day, most of the 12% of the general population who are black are not engaged in criminality. But we keep trying to have a conversation that focuses criminality on them, and that's what happens when you use race. The other thing, there should never be a dichotomy of whether you're going to be safe or you're going to have constitutional rights. Right? You should have constitutional rights, regardless of what it takes to keep you safe. And that's what has happened. It used to be that the government was honest. They said, okay, we see you all as criminals and we're going to treat you all like criminals. This narrative that says we're denying your constitutional rights to keep you safe is, again, it's unethical, it's immoral. And at the end of the day, what we should be trying to figure out is how we keep people safe and observe their constitutional rights. Because yes, people are complaining about crime in high crime areas, but they're also complaining about having their liberty deprived for no reason when they're not doing anything wrong. So why is it that we're more attuned to one complaint and not the other? Why are we being or claiming to be more responsive to the one complaint and ignoring the other?
Well, it looks like any other questions? Oh, sorry, yes, Professor
If
Harris.
nobody else is, okay, just one brief one. I've had this argument with a number of people. Uh, the target of stop, question, and frisk in New York or many other types of proactive policing is guns, because guns bring you to violence, brings you to homicide. So you show the slide that says, hey, you're only getting a very, very small percentage of your stops, frisks. Find any guns. What's with you guys? And the answer is, see, it works, right? Because the guns get left home, therefore we don't have homicides out on the street. I wonder what your response is.
So my response, there are two Ds, right? So there's detecting crime and deterring crime, right? And so Terry originally was for the purpose of detecting crime. And in fact, the behavior of Officer McFadden detected a robbery in progress. The interesting thing about detection, the point that was made by the professor over here, it is measurable. You can measure whether or not your suspicion was accurate based on yield. You can't measure deterrence because you're trying to measure a thing that doesn't happen. There can be all kinds of reasons why that thing didn't happen. But if you're in the position of governmental power, you can claim the reason why it didn't happen was because the police were acting. And who can disprove that? But who can actually definitively prove that is why it happened? So what we produce are crime statistics that say, hey, look, see, the crime went down. With the gun situation in New York, though, there is no pattern of decline that would suggest that stop and frisk had any impact on gun carrying. Now, the interesting thing is when you look at the stats, and I didn't have it in this PowerPoint, it's an up and down pattern. But because it stays between 1,600 and this is actually shootings, 1,600 and 1,800, then people say, oh, well, there's a suppression effect. How do you prove that? How do you disprove it? So by claiming deterrence, the police have positioned themselves pretty well to be able to make a claim that they cannot definitively establish, but it's a claim that we can't definitively disestablish. But the one thing that we can measure is that the tactics, whether they're stop and frisk or broken windows policing, they do not do a good job of detecting serious violent crime, which is allegedly what the police are engaging in this proactive, aggressive policing for. We can also measure the complaints that people are making about the way they're being policed in their community. And how dare anyone say to someone, you don't have a right or you shouldn't be complaining because we're keeping you sick. How paternalistic is that, right? I say, you're harming me by treating me in this way. You say, "Ah, shut up, don't complain, I'm helping you." It's not appropriate.
So we're 5 minutes over, and I apologize for that. We'll start back up again at 3 o'clock, the next panel will.
Heather and I do this dance all the time. Tell her I said hi when you talk to her.
I've only met her once.